The second Nancy Drew Dossier game has 6 suspects, not 4, so we get even more shipping possibilities. Or not, I don't think there's a lot of good couples in this game. We'll start with Nick Blesky. He's the angry boss who yells at Nancy half the time and insults her the other half. He's secretly embezzling money from the Redondo by labeling the money as his weekly bonus. At least that's the case when he's the culprit. If the culprit's somebody else, then the spa owners totally know about his bonuses and they're fine with it. That's sort of the downside to having 6 different culprits. Everybody has their own ending, which reveals they've been lying the whole time. Which personality is correct? Is it normal Nick or culprit Nick? My choice is Nick Blesky with Mrs. Montague because they are both nasty people who are obsessed with money. Not to mention there's a moment towards the start where Nick says she's a nice person. Behind her rough exterior, she spent the first half of her life getting rich, and she's spending the second half of her life donating to charities. Nick sounds pretty earnest when he says this. It's the only time in the game where he uses a softer, gentler tone. It sounds like he actually admires her. He has nothing but contempt for the other characters, so she's the one for him. Cassidy Jones is secretly dating Jasmine Ivy. He likes her so much it worries him. I'm pretty sure that's what he says when they're having a secret meeting in the garden. He feels like he's in over his head, because he normally doesn't do this. I think it's sweet she managed to break through his rough interior. But then, towards the end of the game, the relationship is publicly revealed. Jasmine quickly backpedals and says she wasn't really dating Cassidy, she was just doing research for a role. Cassidy gets upset and leaves, saying, "Now that everyone's done flinging mud at me, I think I'll take a bath in some." So by all accounts, Cassidy's relationship with Jasmine is over. I could see you arguing she was just lying so he wouldn't get fired. She certainly does sound like she's making up the story on the spot. So I'm going to pretend that's what happened. She was just trying to help him out, and she really does love him. In Cassidy's ending, Nancy indicates he and Jasmine are working together. Cassidy then tries to blame Jasmine for everything. But he must be lying because Jasmine gets none of the blame in that ending. When Jasmine's the culprit, Cassidy feels so betrayed, he helps the police decode her diary. So most of the time, Jasmine and Cassidy really care about each other. He's willing to risk losing his job just so he can date her. It's the closest thing this game has to a love story. I pick Cassidy with Jasmine. Mrs. Montague doesn't seem to like anyone besides Mr. Mingles. I said Nick seems to like her, but she doesn't seem to like him back. When Nancy first meets Mrs. Montague, Montague threatens to get her fired, like the last incompetent assistant Blesky sicked on me. You don't talk like that about someone you have a crush on. In her ending, she's so upset about the spa hurting Mr. Mingles, she wants revenge at all costs. She secretly meets with Helfton when he's begging her for funding. She doesn't seem to like him there. She complains to Mr. Mingles that Helfton is tiresome to listen to. I don't think she interacts with any of the other characters. She doesn't like the 2 characters she interacts with. I don't think Mr. Montague ever gets mentioned. She has a husband. Or does she? I always assumed that her husband's dead and she's still using his last name. When she's found guilty, Mr. Mingles is sent to live with a different family. That indicates she doesn't have a husband to take care of her dog when she's gone. I pick Mrs. Montague with no one. She's so nasty, it's hard to picture her at being in a happy relationship. Jasmine Ivy and Cassidy are the best couple of the game, as I talked about earlier. She's a good girlfriend for him, but is he a good boyfriend for her? I'm sure her agent, Simone Mueller, would certainly disapprove of the relationship. She might even force Jasmine to date Brady Armstrong for the publicity. Well, that would be a disaster. Would Jasmine date anybody else? It's hard to picture her with Nick or Helfton. She doesn't interact with them at any point. That's a problem with this game. We only know how she feels about Cassidy and her sister. All other characters are totally irrelevant for her. Well, except Joanna. We know Jasmine doesn't like Joanna. Due to a total lack of other options, I'm going with Jasmine and Cassidy. Helfton Helgeson. Mrs. Montague is the only character he interacts with. He likes animals, she likes animals. They both dislike Nick and the Redondo in general. They can get married and open their own spa where he creates so many wonderful formulas and conditioners to restore her beauty. That would be a dream relationship for him. They both have white hair, so we can guess they're both around the same age. Joanna Brown is creepy. That's her role in the game. She's the creepy one with pet rats who sends threats to Jasmine. She doesn't like Jasmine, and she doesn't like Cassidy because he's dating Jasmine. Joanna doesn't like Nick. She more or less tells Nancy to search Nick's office to find proof of his embezzlement. Joanna doesn't interact with Mrs. Montague directly. She does try to get Mr. Mingles, which is nice of her, but it's pretty clear that was just an excuse to get Joanna out of the way so Nancy can search her room. I can't think of anything to connect Joanna and Helfton, except they both work in the same general area, so maybe they see each other occasionally. I think she should probably date a creepy guy, maybe, or somebody who likes rats, but I can't think of any Nancy Drew characters who fit the bill. Maybe Taylor Sinclair? I don't know. So I'm picking Joanna Brown with no one. Nancy Drew. I would pair her with Cassidy, who's the only guy who's around her age, and he kinda likes her. There aren't any other good options among the game's cast, okay? It's either Nancy with Cassidy or Nancy with no one. To recap, I picked Nick Blesky with Mrs. Montague, Cassidy Jones with Jasmine Ivy, Mrs. Montague with no one, Jasmine Ivy with Cassidy Jones, Helfton Helgeson with Mrs. Montague, Joanna Brown with no one, Nancy Drew with Cassidy. What does the internet say? Nick Blesky with Mrs. Montague and Nancy Drew. I'm surprised Joanna was a popular option. Nick never talks about Joanna, ever. Cassidy Jones with Jasmine and Nancy. Mrs. Montague with Nick and none. None was the majority. Jasmine Ivy with Cassidy and none. It's not a huge surprise that the only couple in the game makes for the most popular pairing. Helfton Helgeson with Mrs. Montague with 73% of the vote, wow, and then him with none. Joanna Brown with Nick and Helfton. Those are both relationships I did not consider. Nancy Drew with Cassidy, but it's more popular to have Nancy Drew with none. Overall, I'd say it's not a good game for shipping, because the characters don't interact much, and unlike the main Nancy Drew games, you can't get the characters to talk about each other. It's hard to picture any relationships in this game beyond Jasmine and Cassidy, because they're actually dating in the game. Mrs. Montague and Nick, they can kind of be a couple because they're both angry and greedy, but then that leaves Helfton with Joanna, and they don't interact with each other at all, so I can't see them as a couple.